pharmaceutical industry is very clever. It's very well funded. It has some great people and some very intelligent and ethical people too. I don't want to paint them as an unethical organization, and I don't want to say all drugs are bad either, because there are some extremely important life-saving drugs. There are drugs, for infections, for pain, for cancer, for asthma, for heart conditions that are very, very important. We want the pharmaceutical industry to succeed. At the same time, we want people to be taking medicine on the basis of need and appropriate need, not on the basis of the greed of the pharmaceutical companies. And the problem that we've documented, and it's not just myself, but other people over the years have looked at the drug industry and said, it's such a massively powerful and rich organization that they can influence the hierarchy of medicine from the top to bottom. And this is what we discussed in our book, Selling Sickness, where even at the grassroots, where you've got patient groups who are organized around diseases, maybe lung cancer or heart disease or asthma or osteoporosis. And those patient groups, while well-meaning, are funded partly by the pharmaceutical industry. So the information they produce is oftentimes in favor of treatment that we would consider to be inappropriate, or in favor of government spending money on drugs that probably aren't necessary. So you've got the patient groups, then you've got the physicians, because let's face it, doctors can't, or should I say, consumers can't go and buy a drug off the shelf. A prescription drug needs a prescription, and you have to go through a physician to get it. So the amount of marketing and just sales pressure that goes on to our physicians is phenomenal. It's mind-blowing, actually, and I've seen it firsthand. I'm revolted by most of it, because I study I look closely at drug studies, and I see what information doctors are getting from pharmaceutical sales reps, and I'm horrified how misled they can be about the benefits, because they're not all the times are they using independent information. They're using information that was given to them by the drug reps. So, and the higher layers, you got perhaps the apex of the hierarchy of the medical journals and the key opinion leaders, and these would be the specialists, the prominent Harvard or Princeton or academic professors who all the other doctors look up to. And so a lot of times, those physicians would be on the payroll of Merck or Pfizer. They would be paid to do research. They would consult for the company. They would be spokespeople for the company. And a lot of times they would go and do education to other doctors. So that's just in the medical world. Then you've got the political world as well. And we know that pharma has probably more lobbyists in Washington than any other organization. And that's possibly why we have such a drug-centric approach to healthcare. You don't have any other industry nearly as powerful lobbying decision makers around drugs like we do with pharma. And the way we know one of the ways we know how powerful it is here in U.S. is that the lobbyists, the drug lobbyists, wander the halls of Congress, and they meet with our representatives, and they educate them about the value of their new drugs and so on. And at the same time, there is a revolving door sometimes between the officials, the regulators, and the pharmaceutical industry. So you see people who either used to work for the FDA, now work for a company, or work for the company and now work for the FDA. So this door of that level of interaction, that culture between the high-level drug industry officials and regulators is quite profound. And that's troubling on many levels. I mean, if anything, you should be having very little contact between those who are making regulatory decisions and those who are promoting drugs. I'll tell you one other thing that I think is quite troubling, and that both in Canada and the US, in order to get your drug approved, which means you get a license to sell the drug in your nation, it has to go through a certain level of review at the regulatory level, right? Well, who pays for those reviews? Well, you think, the taxpayer pays for them, right? Because the taxpayer is ultimately the client. Well, no. Both in Canada and the US, we charge the drug companies to review. The FDA gets money from the pharmaceutical industry in order to conduct the reviews to approve the drugs. So guess what? Who's their client? Is it the taxpayer, who it should be, or is it the company who is paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to get their drug to market? And I'm not the only one. There's other people who have said this is really distorting the market for pharmaceuticals because it's an unhealthy influence on the approval and regulation of pharmaceuticals. Direct-to-consumer advertising of pharmaceuticals is probably the worst idea that we've ever had. Because as I said, you can't go and buy a drug off the shelf. It's not like an iPhone or a car. You have to go through a learned intermediary who is your physician. The conversation when it comes to something to do with your health should be between you and your doctor, and it should concern your health. So what happens though is that you get people who watch nightly TV, read magazines and newspapers. You get this onslaught of direct advertising of drugs, sometimes those drugs. In fact, when I come to America, I always go and turn on the TV in the hotel room so I can watch the ads. And I'm often shocked, as I was this week here in New York, seeing that they're advertising very expensive, very toxic cancer drugs on TV. Cancer drugs. And they're advertising antipsychotics, and as if they are some benign, helpful drugs that allow you to romp through the field with your grandchildren. The problem, of course, is that we allow direct-to-consumer advertising in the U.S. I think it's very controversial. There's only 2 countries in the world that allow it: the U.S. and New Zealand, and we see the effects of that in terms of people going into their doctors and demanding, I saw that on TV, I would like to try that treatment. And this has been studied as well, that, and I've been in studies where we've looked at this, and that if patients ask doctors for particular things, they are more often than not going to get it. So we know the direct-to-consumer advertising works a lot of times. It pays for itself, and it's worth obviously billions of dollars. If we're talking about American hospitals, they're parts of organizations that are often profit-driven, and so they have to compete for customers, and they do what I would say some very unusual things. So if you have to compete for customers for prostate cancer surgery, you might go out and buy a $5 million robotic surgery device that you can then advertise as having the latest high-tech device to remove somebody's prostate. We'd like to think that hospitals are independent, publicly oriented, and some, in many cases they are. But at the same time, in a situation where they're competing for patients, there's always going to be things such as overcharging. And when you're competing for patients and you're dealing with insurers and so on, hospitals, like anyone else, can charge what the market will bear. And I don't know the American hospital system as well as the Canadian one. We have public hospitals and no money changes hands. In America, it's a very different thing. I think that people still go to medical school for the right reasons. It's a respectable profession. It's well paid, but it's hard work, and you got to be smart. And part of the problem with the way medicine works is that what doctors learn in medical school might be out of sync with what consumers want in the community. I'll give you a good example. How much does doctors learn about basic pharmacology and pharmacokinetics? Do they actually know how the drugs work? Well, when I've looked at surveys of medical curricula around the country, very little basic science around pharmacology and very poor information around prescribing. They learn about that when they get to the wards and when they start working and doing their residencies and so on. And so the basic information, the thing that a doctor does probably more than anything, is write prescriptions. And that's lacking. And that is information, that is training that they're getting from people who may not be the best, anyway, so there's that the fact that there are missing parts to the curriculum. And one of the major missing parts, I think, is indicated from this conference. I mean, physicians admittedly learn almost nothing about nutrition. They learn very little about alternatives, very little about, complementary medicine, acupuncture, and things like that. I'm not saying that those are always good options, but at least, nutrition is something so very basic to human health. You would think that would be a fundamental core of medical curriculum, and it isn't. And that's why, in the community, you've got people who are quite distrustful of the medical system because they think, oh, my doctor's just a pusher. I don't want drugs. I don't want a pharmaceutical solution. I'd like to do something else. And there are admittedly, some very good doctors who know nutrition and are able to give very good advice. But a lot of times, it was described to me by a physician who said, our heads are just full of logos of drugs. You come in, well, you're a Zocor patient. Next page, oh yeah, you're a Celexa patient. So, and that because of it's a difficult job being a doctor as well, where the visits are short, the demands are high, patients come in with, reams of stuff that they found on the internet and they want you to look at it. There's a lot of demands on physicians, but at the same time, they don't make their job easier by having frequent contact with the pharmaceutical industry. That just, one way to describe it is that finding good medical information is like finding a needle in a haystack. When you add drug marketing into it, it just makes the haystack bigger. This is my first time at the Real Truth About Health conference. Why did I come? Partly because like a lot of what's being taught here about nutrition, about questioning, basic principles about psychiatry and how people are being treated, people need to understand what's happening with the pharmaceutical industry. And, I think this is a very receptive audience because people here, I think, are largely have seen through the behind the curtain of the pharmaceutical industry, and they've moved on to other things, and that's really good. I would love to see this grow as well. In fact, instead of 10,000, it would be nice to see 10 million followers. It's important for me, anyways, to give the message of truth about the pharmaceutical industry in whatever audience that I get invited to. And I've spoken at industry-funded conferences. I'm not as welcome there. I've spoken to physician groups and pharmacist groups and universities, and I've spoken at law schools and with groups of nurses and other practitioners. And I say to them the same thing that I say to the individual public, in that we have allowed the pharmaceutical industry an inordinate chunk of our medical world. We've given it to them. It's time to take it back. And we have to take it back in a reasonable and appropriate way by saying, yes, you might have drugs that might be beneficial, but we want to try things that are safer, less expensive, and possibly more effective in the long term. And people need to know about alternatives. And I think one of the problems with the way medicine is practiced is that it's so pharmacentric, is that people don't hear about other things. They don't hear about nutrition from their doctors. And they think if the doctor's not telling them about nutrition, it must not be that important. Well, that's so far from the truth. Back to the truth of the health conference, we do have doctors here who are talking about nutrition, who are talking about the problems with the way we're polluting the environment, or using diets that are simply unsustainable for humanity, for that matter. And it's really great to have that information out there.